All right, we're live. It's the J23 Community Podcast. It's clarity for those who are curious or confused about all things Christian. I'm Jeremiah Wood, along with the good doctor, Nick Hardcastle, and this is episode
along with the good
20. Yep, we're live. That's good. Yeah, it's real good. So it has been a couple of weeks since we've been on. Unfortunately, it is man, it's just that time of year. Nick, I was thinking about this the other day, how throughout the entirety of the year, from about mid-August to the end of October is the busiest time for us as a family, as my family, because I got 3 kids, 10, 11, and 12. They are all in sports. They have combined like 10 practices every week. On top of that, there's anywhere from 3 to 5 games over the weekend, and sometimes it is just a lot to be able to carve out time to get together and do a video. So my apologies for the busyness.
All good. Yeah, we are not there yet. Obviously, one on the way, or I guess for those who unaware, on my end, first baby on the way.
Yeah,
but
January,
we don't have.
Right?
Yep, January. We don't have. We don't have the soccer practice or the football practice yet. So it's yeah, we have a few years, but I get what you're going through. Everybody that I work with, everybody that I'm around, yourself who has kids like that, it's just a churn. So I'm watching, kind of at the back into this tunnel, looking towards what I'm going to be going through. So it's going to be fun though.
Yeah, one of the best pieces of advice that I think I'd ever received when it came to kids, it said, always be present in the moment and enjoy every season you're in. Never wish you were out of the season you're in, and never hope for the next season, because you will always miss the previous one. So make sure you just love the current season that you're in.
That's what we're going to be focusing on. And that's what we're doing right now, just waiting for the current season. So speaking of seasons, since it's been a season since we got started on this chapter, you want to give us a little bit of a recap of the first part of Genesis 15 that we talked about a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, we've been in Genesis 15 for a couple of weeks, and we're leading up to what is kind of the climax, I feel like, of Abraham's story, the covenant that God makes with Abram. But at the beginning of 15, Abram finished up with all these events with Lot, with meeting Melchizedek, with establishing his life in Mamre. And it's just really interesting because we kind of see this almost like doubt creeping into Abram's life. And we talk to him, or we see him talking to the Lord. And it says that after these events, God said to Abram, he said, "Do not be afraid. I am your shield, and your reward will be very great." And so Abram starts having this conversation with God and saying, well, who's going to be my heir? You promised me children. You promised me a nation. And I had not even had a son yet. So what am I supposed to do? And so we see kind of how Abram went through this season of silence where he was asking God what was going on, and he kind of wasn't getting an answer. And then God leads him outside to kind of reflect. And we just see Abram kind of dealing with his own doubt, dealing with his unbelief, and God is kind of dealing with him in this season, really with some silence, but also with some reassurance. And we're kind of picking up on that part where the reassurance is starting to come in.
Yeah, I mean, right on the front of this, the famous verse, and he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. So that's kind of the, I guess, intro that we have going into this story. So what we can do now is just jump into this section of scripture that we're going to be focusing on tonight, I guess, with all of that held in our mind. And let's just kind of see what the back half of Genesis 15 has to say. So I'll jump in and do some reading.
Perfect. Let's do it.
Genesis 15, starting in verse 7. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord, how am I to know that I shall possess it? And he said to him, Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought to him all these, cut them in half, and laid each half against the other. But he did not cut the birds in half. And when the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. And as the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram. And behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in the land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation they serve, and afterwards they shall come out with great possessions. For you shall go to your fathers, you shall be buried in a good old age, and they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And when the sun had gone down, and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between the pieces. And on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, To your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river of the Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Kadamites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites.
That's good. That's good. So here's kind of where this whole thing starts. God has been dealing with Abram and Abram's doubt and unbelief. And when we start in verse 7, like you said in verse 6, it said that Abram believed the Lord, and the Lord credited it to Abram as righteousness, right? And we kind of looked at that idea of belief last time. And this whole concept of belief wasn't really about believing this information or having all the information to be convinced of something, but rather it was that word belief is probably better understood as faithfulness. And so Abram was faithful to the Lord, or maybe surrendered himself to the Lord, or gave himself over completely to the Lord. And so then the Lord credited it to him as righteousness. And so once Abram did that, verse 7, God began to talk to Abram. And I think that's a really important point to start out with, is that when we, oftentimes we struggle with this idea, like, why is God not speaking to me? Why am I constantly praying, constantly asking God for things, but never hearing from the Lord? And kind of the reality of the situation is that oftentimes God is waiting for us to really come to the end of ourselves. What do you think about that, Nick?
Yeah, and I think he's probably also looking for the opportunity to where he can be a present, or you can be present with him. He's always present, but you can be present with him. Yeah. And I think it's kind of an interesting statement that God says here in verse 7. He just goes in there and says, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. It's kind of an odd statement.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we probably hear God speak to us in odd statements, and we just want to like redirect it to what's on our heart and mind, which honestly we probably see Abram doing in this moment.
Yeah.
Whenever he goes into, specifically verse 8, he says, "O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it?" So I think God in that moment he's waiting for us to be present with him, but in his goodness, at least with Abram at this time, whenever he's coming off a super high moment, when the Lord credited these things as righteousness, he was present with him. But honestly, at that point in time, I think that the Lord was giving Abram a little bit of space to be himself. It's funny how we start off, or, just a couple verses ago saying that, the Lord counted Abram as being faithful or righteous,
Mm.
and then boom, we're just back down to square one again. It's kind of like a little circle that's going on and on. So what do you think,
Yeah.
Jeremiah?
Well, when I look at specifically verse 8, it makes me wonder, Abram has this concept. So God's saying, "Hey, I brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans, and I'm going to give you this land so that you can possess it." And I wonder if Abram almost misinterprets that word, right? Because he says, "I want to give you this land for you to possess." But then Abram kind of interprets it as you need to go and possess this land, right? So rather than it being a gift from God, it's something that Abram has to go and do, that he has to strive for, he has to accomplish, and when God gives Abram this promise, instead of Abram looking at God, Abram's looking at himself, and he's just like, "How do I know I could even do this?"
Yeah, and I think also, the term possess it, if we get back to really whenever God starts talking about people possessing a land, the definition of it needs to be a lot closer to what, Adam and Eve in the garden. They were there to tend to it and to take care of it. It wasn't just about like, you get to own this plot of land. It's that you are supposed to represent God on this plot of land, as opposed to just like owning this chunk of land. And, I think that that's a really unique thing in the fact that whenever we talk about how we should possess something, like, Jeremiah, you own your blue shirt that you have on, you possess it, so you're going to wear it
Yeah.
around. It's not necessarily like that. It's more of like, I want you to use it for my purposes. I mean, do you think that in the middle of that, we honestly mess up our definition of possess it at that point in time?
Yeah, probably so. It kind of reminds me and kind of takes me back to the garden whenever the Lord was giving Adam and Eve instructions and saying that they should rule the land and subdue it, right? So not only live in the land, but to take charge over it and be God's representation in the land and to do with it as God himself would do with it. And so I think that there's probably some callback here a little bit. And again, it seems like kind of what you mentioned earlier. Abram's kind of got this idea of ownership and maybe rulership and maybe even like kind of a dominion mentality. Like, oh, I'm supposed to be the king over this land, and rather the Lord saying, well, it's not that you're supposed to be the king over this land, but you are to this land will be yours, and you are to represent your king, who is the Lord himself. And it's
Yeah,
really interesting. Oh, go ahead.
no, sorry, I wasn't trying to cut you off. I just jumped in the Blue Letter Bible to look a little bit more at that word possess, and it actually doesn't even possess at all. It's in the Hebrew, it means to see, to look at, inspect, perceive, or consider.
Hmm.
So he honestly is like, I gave you this land to look at it, to see it. I'm not
Interesting.
I'm not giving it to you to own at this point in time.
Yeah, which makes sense because we'll read later on down in like verse 13 through 16. But it's interesting because in verse 8, it seems like Abram's got this kind of like element of doubt in the situation. And so in verse 9, we see God just shifting gears and automatically going into the idea of a covenant. And look what verse 9 says. He says, so go get, the Lord said to Abram, bring me a 3-year-old cow, bring me a 3-year-old female goat, and a 3-year-old ram, and turtle dove, and young pigeons. And so Abram brought all of these things to him, and he split them down the middle, and he laid the pieces opposite of each other, but he did not cut the birds. The birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. And as the sun was setting, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and suddenly a terror and great darkness descended on him. So here's what's interesting, is Abram is going through this element of doubt, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
then the Lord tells Abram, go and get these animals for me. Now, at first, I thought maybe there was some deeper meaning with the different animals, the 3-year-old cow, the 3-year-old goat, and maybe there is, but I didn't have time to really dig deep into that to kind of figure that out. But maybe you, the listener, if you want to do a deep dive in the significance of these animals and their age, feel free to dive in and see what you can find. But here's what the Lord was initiating something very specific. The Lord was initiating a covenant between himself and Abram, right? So again, let's look at it. God said, I am the Lord. I'm giving you this land to possess it, to see it, to observe it, all of these things. And Abram says, I have doubts. And so the Lord's response is, let's make a covenant. So when the Lord gave Abram these instructions, Abram already knew what to do, because at that time in the Mediterranean, there was a covenant called a suzerain vassal covenant. Are you familiar with suzerain vassal, Nick?
I am, but we will let you go ahead and define it for the listener.
Well, it's not really. You could go deep into it, but it's basically two parts. There is a more powerful part, and then there is somebody who needs something part, right? It is the person who is the beneficiary and the person who is the benefactor, if you can say it that way. But it's a type of agreement between a powerful ruler and a lesser ruler, or a head of household. And the powerful ruler is the suzerain, and they would set these terms of the covenant for the lesser ruler, who is the vassal. And the two of them would agree to it. And the way that they would make this covenant with one another is they would take these animals, they would sacrifice them and cut them in half, just like Abram was doing. And then they would both walk through back and forth in between these animal carcasses, and they would make the commitment and say things like, let it be done to me as it was done to these animals if I break this covenant. And so when Abram was showing doubt, the Lord said, hey, let's make a covenant. That way you would understand something very significant, that I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans, and where you are lacking, I will be your benefactor. I will be the more powerful ruler over you to make sure that you will receive everything I've promised you. But it does get a little more interesting from there.
Yeah. So in one of my Bibles, it talks about how you most of the time we talk about going backwards to look and find meaning in the text, but this one might be the time that's also worth going forward and finding a little bit of meaning in the text, because this exact covenant is also brought up in Jeremiah 34, verse 8. And I guess my Bible that I'm looking at right now, it talks about how actually this covenant was in multiple different societies at that point in time. It said that the Hittites used it whenever they had a defeated army and they were making that army pledge a loyalty to them. Assyria did it as well. It was an Aramaic treaty, but in totality, no matter what, whoever was entering into this covenant, there was the superior one and there was the inferior one. The one was, lesser. So that's really something important to think about, because we know who the top part of this covenant is, but the bottom is. And what happens if you don't fulfill the covenant is something probably pretty important to pull out for the context of the rest of the story. So in Jeremiah 34, verse 18 through 20, it says, the men who have violated my covenant and have not fulfilled the terms of the covenant they made before me, I will treat like the calf they cut in two. And when they walk and then walked between its pieces, the leaders of Judah and Jerusalem, the courts of the officials, the priests, and the people of the land who walked between the pieces of the calf, I will hand over to my enemies who seek their lives. Their dead bodies will become food for the birds of the air and beasts for the earth. So in this specific covenant, if someone were to break it, it's pretty much saying that whoever breaks this covenant will die. They will become
Yeah.
like dead bodies that they cut in half.
Yeah.
So I guess one little nugget when you're looking up the age of the animals is go look up Jeremiah 34, verse 18.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of the situation in this whole suzerain vassal covenant idea. Hey, Matt, thanks for joining us tonight, man. It's good to see you on here. Is that you have somebody who provides the benefits, right? So the suzerain, the more powerful ruler, he would provide the benefits to the vassal. And a lot of that really included land and territory as well, but also military protection. And so then the vassal, who was the lesser ruler, the vassal would owe the suzerain things like financial contribution, but also loyalty and allyship and things of that nature. And so if the suzerain ever needed to call on the vassal to come and do something, then they should be able to come and do that right away. My resources also say that the suzerain would offer blessings to the vassal if they were committed to the covenant, but that they would also provide curses to the vassal if they're not faithful to the covenant. And what's interesting about that is later on in the scripture, in Genesis, we see that very thing. The Lord says, "I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you." Yeah, and so this is interesting also about the suzerain vassal covenants was that the covenants would often be witnessed by both divine beings as well as earthly beings, which is another really interesting part of this kind of covenant. And so the last part of the covenant was copies were made for both sides, and they would be read often, and they would be read as a reminder of the covenant that you were committed to.
Yeah. But Jeremiah, I see a problem.
What is that problem, Nick?
Well, sometimes Abram gets it right, like we
Yeah.
were just talking about a second ago. Whenever we were talking about in Genesis 14, whenever he trusted the Lord and gave possessions over, but sometimes Abram really gets it wrong.
Yeah.
And on the heels of this story, we're about to see Abram really get it wrong here in a second. Not necessarily in this story, but he can get it wrong and right. But in a good act of benevolence, something happened to Abram, and the Lord put him into a deep sleep.
Yeah. Start reading it like verse 12.
Yeah. So in Genesis 15, verse 12, and as the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, a dreadful great darkness fell upon him. So I want to stop there, and I'd love to hear where you want to take it from that. But I have a couple things that I want to really just kind of put in perspective that stand out to me in this story. It's that, we were talking about a suzerain vassal covenant where there is that inferior and superior one in there. I would like to also argue that God's not just looking to sit there and say that he is superior over Abram. He knows that already, but I think he's actually looking for a partner. I think he's looking for a partner in this. I don't think he's just looking for someone to be beneath him, because the last time there was a deep sleep like this mentioned in the Bible, it goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 2. And the funny part about it is, if you look at it, we're going to find some, birds of the air there and some beasts of the field. But let's see here. So Genesis chapter 2, verse 20. Verse 20. So the man gave names to all the livestock, the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. We've had some birds of the air and beasts of the field in this story.
Yeah.
But there was but for Adam, no suitable helper was found. So God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep. And while he was sleeping, he took out of the man's ribs and closed up the place with the flesh. And the Lord, and the Lord God made a woman from the rib, and he had taken out of the man and brought her to the man. And the man said, "This is now the bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh." So, honestly, God knows that Abram could and will mess this up. But he's not just looking to have someone that is subservient to him. He's looking for a partner. Because the last time that God put someone into a deep sleep like this, he turned him into a partner.
Yeah, that's good.
What do you think, Jeremiah?
Well, I was going to ask, what do you think that the suddenly a terror and great darkness descended on him was? What do you think that terror and darkness was?
Yeah, while he was asleep, huh? I do not have an
Yes.
answer to that one.
I don't either. That's one of those verses that you look at and you're just like, well, that can't be the Lord, because I mean, maybe the terror, because you could have the fear of the Lord. And I know that anytime, maybe that was the terror, right? Because anytime you're in the presence of God, that you would surely die, right? So maybe that's where the terror came from, but I don't know what the great darkness was, because the darkness sounds like something that was opposite of who God is and how he represents himself.
Yeah, I mean, especially whenever he talks about, God being light in the darkness, he's always drawing light into the world.
Right.
So maybe, I mean, it was just saying that even at that present time, there was something trying to come against that, trying to come against that partnership being established right there.
Could be. Another thing that crossed my mind is, I know that at times, whenever we have to kind of face ourselves, we have to kind of look at ourselves in the mirror, if that makes sense. That could be terrifying as well. And you can really begin to recognize how great of maybe darkness that there is within. And nothing brings about an awareness of your own darkness than being in the presence and holiness of God.
Yeah, or recognizing that you are now vulnerable. One note that I'd read about this story before was, it said that if you took the entirety of this covenant, you could identify a couple of different things, especially when you pull in that part of Jeremiah 34 with it. But it says, like, the animals represent Israel, and the birds of prey that came down that Abram drove away represented the enemies of Israel at that point in time. So maybe at that point in time, he had kind of recognized or thought that, there would be no one to stand for and protect this covenant with. I don't know.
Right.
I'm just kind of grasping at something right here, but I do agree that whenever you're in the presence of God in all of his holiness, it can be intimidating. And we can also find ourselves in a space where we're trying to put it into perspective, but it's something that we don't truly always see. And as humans, since we are flesh, it can be hard for us to sometimes put that into, really perspective about it.
Yeah. Philip just said that Jackie Hill Perry has a quote that said, "God slowly shows us our sin so we don't get discouraged with it," which that's a good quote right there. Thanks, Philip. I appreciate that, Ben. I want to skip verses 13 through 16. We'll come back to that here in a minute, because I feel like that's kind of a sub point that the author put in. And I want to focus on the remainder of that covenant real quick. So let's go to verse 17. So again, the Lord, Abram was doubting. So the Lord said, all right, let's make a covenant. Abram starts the process of making a covenant, but then he falls into a deep sleep. Then we go into verse 17. It says, then the sun had set and it was dark. And then all of a sudden, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch appeared and passed between the divided animals. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, I give this land to your offsprings from the brook of Egypt to the Euphrates River, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Kedemites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. And so, again, this is where the Lord did this covenant, just like we talked about, that the suzerain and the vassal, the benefactor and the recipient, both walked through at the same time. But Nick, who did not walk through this covenant?
Well, there was a guy sleeping on the ground that was not very far from this, I guess, named Abram.
That's right. That's right. Abram was supposed to walk between the animals with the Lord. The Lord walked through. It says that that he appeared in two ways. One was a smoking fire pot, and the other was a flaming torch. And the fire pot walked between the animals. That's the Lord. That represents the Lord walking through. But then the torch passed between the animals. And without going too deeply into all of it, this is the beauty of what God was saying to Abram with this covenant, right? Again, let's start at the beginning. Abram doubted, so the Lord said, let's make a covenant. And so in Abram's mind, he knows exactly what to do and how this is going to play out. He gets the animals, he sets them up, and he's thinking that he is going to pass between them with him and God. But he falls into a deep sleep. He has terror and darkness, and all of a sudden God passes through once, and then God passes through again. The reason why God passed through two times, he's saying, Abram, I will uphold my end of the covenant, and I will uphold your end of the covenant. I am the Lord your God, and I will be your shield and your very great reward. There is nothing that you need to do except only to be still and to receive it. I am the one that will uphold both ends. What do you think, Nick?
I mean, it just shows that the Lord is the same in Genesis as he is in Revelation. He's a good God, and he's there to honestly just try to be there to partner with people. And he makes a lot of space and a lot of room for a being that's not able to be in a covenant with him, but he wants to partner in that same covenant.
Right. Like he's not coming at us with anything that he desires us to partner with him in, and thinks, man, I sure hope this guy can uphold his end of the deal. Like he's not looking at us like that. He looks at us and he says, man, I see something in you. I want to invite you on this journey with me. And I know for myself, this is perfectly clear that I will sit here every single day and look at all my faults and all my flaws and think, God, why would you ever call me to do this? I do not have what it takes. And then the Lord passes through the covenant twice. I know you don't have what it takes, but I do. So I will uphold my end, and then I will uphold your end also. This is, I forget the word, but it is foreshadowing implications of both how he calls us into the things that he partners us in, that he invites us to partner with him in, but it's also the foreshadowing of our own salvations also. He said, I will come to earth, I will live a sinless life, and then I will be the sacrifice, I will be the resurrection, I will defeat sin and death, and you will receive the benefits. And so this is just a beautiful foreshadowing of everything that's to come.
Yeah, and it honestly gives us, I don't know, looking at this chapter 15 in a whole, listener, viewer, if you ever get the opportunity to spend some deep time in this by yourself, and you just think about the fact that, we're Abram in this story. That's honestly the only person we can be. We can't be the other half of this, but it shows how, number one, God can deal with someone who's being themselves and being pretty real. Yeah. Abram, he was a little bit snarky in the middle of some of this stuff. He was, pushing back. He was kind of asking some of God, but also in the middle of that, God met him where he was at in the entirety of that, saying, like, go out and look at the stars. Like, I put these in place. And then, he's like, I'm going to bless you, buddy. And he says, well, how am I supposed to know you're going to do this? And he really, honestly, at that point in time, the only thing he truly asked Abram to do is to sit with him. He asks him to prepare a covenant for the
Yeah.
two of them,
Yeah.
and then he puts him to sleep. And he
Mhm.
says, so, I mean, if we really think about ourselves as kind of Abram in this, is we find God pretty often in maybe some of our worst moments. And hopefully the way that we can work through those moments with him can say a lot. But one of the most important things about this is also that sometimes in rest, in peace, and in all honesty, just sitting back and saying, I know the Lord's enough, and I'm
Yeah.
just going to turn it over to him. That's whenever he'll actually speak and put it into motion for us. Because sometimes he needs us just to stop moving and to shut down for a little bit so we can make some room for him to do, honestly, what he's there to do, and that's to carry us through these situations.
Yeah. 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 It's incredible how the Lord really begins to do the work that he's going to do only when Abram finds himself in that place of rest. And what's funny is it reminds me of a couple things. One, he makes him rest. Says that Abram didn't choose to rest. It just said like a deep sleep fell over him.
Yeah.
Makes me think of Elijah when he's running from Ahab and Jezebel. And as he's running, the Lord makes him go to sleep. So he makes him take a nap. He makes him eat some food. And he said, listen, you're not going to be able to serve me and do the things that I have prepared in advance for you to do if you're running in this kind of hurried anxiousness. And so he makes him rest. It also makes me think of Psalms 23, that he makes us lie down in green pastures. He makes us rest. He makes us refuel. He gives us the very thing we need to have the strength to do all that God is calling us to do. And so I just think it's really interesting that all of this is given in a place of rest, even if God himself had to make Abram rest.
That's right. And I don't know. I mean, we just start talking about all these other moments in the Bible, and I see these things just, coming back over and over and over again. And it just honestly just truly shows that there's not necessarily like a playbook to get it right. Because
Right.
I mean, if we did, we'd be able to figure out how to win the Super Bowl or whatever, but by right now. But it's that if we just sit there and trust in the Lord and let him run the plays in our life, and just just take a back seat and just trust in him, he can do stuff that's out of our mind and out of this world, out of this world. And the simplest things that we can do. And honestly, maybe sometimes we just need to sit back in the middle of that and try to notice him and thank him for the goodness that he has in those moments. So I don't know. It's such a cool story. And that's why I'm kind of glad that we took a couple weeks to be able to sit here and talk about Genesis 15.
Yeah, it's so good. I think one of the things that I was thinking of. Sorry, I'm messaging real quick.
That's okay. We have Matt asking you a question, Jeremiah.
Okay.
Matt asked, what are some of the hardest moments God showed up for you the most?
Great question. Yeah, that's so good. My life has been a series of hardship, I think. And without going into too many of them, I would say the biggest thing that God had called us to, and a lot of people don't know this about our family, but our three youngest are all adopted, and when my wife and I were married, it was just her, myself, and our oldest. And the Lord began to speak to our hearts and say, like, listen, I want you to grow your family. I want you to be a father to the fatherless, and I want you to adopt some kids. And we tried out several routes of adoption and realized that the foster care system was the direction the Lord had for us. And so the lady that was getting us prepped for the foster care system, she said, well, what do you guys want? I said, well, we want babies. And well, not just babies. We want to bring babies home from the hospital. And we want them to all be siblings. We want to bring one baby home. And then every time the mom has another baby, we want to bring that baby home as well. And the lady said, oh, that's nice. And I can guarantee you 100% that that will never happen. And we're like, well, that's what we want. And the Lord brought us to this, so maybe he's going to give us an answer to a prayer. And lo and behold, our daughter came, and just 11 months later, our son came, and another maybe 12, 13 months later, our other son came. And from the hospital, from the same mom, siblings, just how we had asked. Now, the adoption process took about 3.5 years for each one. And during that time, that 3.5 year time, there were multiple situations where we felt like the babies were going to get taken away from us. And when we were, for several different reasons, not because of anything we did wrong, but a lot of because their nationality and heritage. And so we thought the babies were going to get taken away from us. And every night we would put the kids to bed and we would pray for them. And we would just surrender everything and just say, Lord, you called us to this. You wanted us to do this, and we need you to show up. And I remember it was Mother's Day, 2015. And that Sunday morning, I don't know why we got a phone call on Sunday, but we had received a phone call on Sunday morning. There had been a court case on Friday, and at the court case, the judge made a ruling that said these babies will forever and always stay with the Wood family. And we just proceeded from there to adopt all three of them. And yeah, it was a beautiful thing. It was hard. It was ridden with some of the darkest, hardest times that I've ever experienced in my life. But Matt, just as you had said, man, God showed up. Because we were just leaning in as best we knew how. There was nothing we could do. There was no way that we could fight the system that was coming at us. And so the only thing we had was to trust the Lord in this whole situation. So that's at least one of probably the many stories I could share with you about that.
That's a great story. But you honestly see God at work in that, and it's just so cool that happened. Honestly, just to think about the fact that a judge made a ruling so these babies will always be with the Wood family. It's like God had to be doing that in there. So
yeah,
so cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It was funny. One of the guys that were actually trying to get the babies taken away from us, he was standing there just completely defeated. And he said, somebody higher than me told me that the babies had to stay with the Wood family.
Yeah, I think so. Maybe the person who told Abram to go to sleep and make a covenant.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wouldn't say person, but yeah.
Yeah, it was miraculous. The Lord was in it.
Yeah.
Man, it's already 45 minutes in. That's crazy. I want to touch base because we're talking about the goodness of God and all this, and how He is the one who is doing His part of the covenant, but also He's fulfilling Abram's part of the covenant as well. It just points out to how good and faithful and patient that He is. Let's look at verse 13 through 16 real quick. It says this: Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain. Boy, that's a statement in and of itself. Know for certain, your offsprings will be strangers in this land that does not belong to them. They will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. However, I will judge the nations that they serve, and afterwards they will go out with many possessions. But you will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a ripe age. And in the 4th generation they will return here. This is the interesting part. For the iniquity of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. So, Nick, verses 13 and 14, um, what is the Lord speaking about? Knowing the story as we know it, what's he talking about?
Well, obviously, he was talking about in that really specific chunk right there, kind of, I guess, a foreshadow into the Exodus out of Egypt. But
Yeah,
also, if we put the context of when this story was being told to Moses with the Israelites, he honestly is just sitting there saying that it kind of is a connectivity in there on how that entirety of that situation takes place. And um, yeah, I do agree. Like it's a good thing to kind of keep that in context. Also, going into this is, I'm sure a lot of Israelites or Hebrews at that point in time were probably sitting there saying, "Well, God, why didn't you speed this up? You know, you told this to
yeah,
Abram so long ago." I'm sure that a lot of them were probably like, noticed Abram in that story and how God had room for it, but he took that time to at least give him a little bit of a download on why that happened. Um,
yeah.
and I think that honestly, probably the biggest part about why that happens takes place in verse 16. Jeremiah, what do you think?
Yeah, so it says, in the fourth generation they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. Now, here is the situation with the Amorites, and I can't go into incredible detail because I'm not super schooled in the history of the Amorites, but the Amorites were wicked, wicked people. They were demon worshippers. They offered child sacrifices. They were cannibals. They would burn their children to the god of Molech. They would offer like women sacrifices and all these different horrific things. And they did all of this. It was like black magic. And so you can imagine the most evil of the evil of the evilest of people. And at this moment in time with Abram, the Lord's looking at the Amorites and he's having patience with them. He already knows how far they will go. But it reminds me of the verse that we read in Peter, and that the Lord is patient he is patient in ways that we don't even understand patience, but he desires that none should perish, but that all should come to repentance. And so this is again another just statement of the goodness of God, that he is showing his patience towards the Amorites so that maybe, just maybe, they might come to repentance.
Yeah, and honestly, that does a lot as well when we start thinking about the Hebrew people, about what we're going to see coming out of them going forward.
Yeah.
Is that he has a lot of space to be able to deal with the grossness of the world and
Mm-hmm.
wait for us to hopefully to come back around. And this might be a totally dumb comment, but you start talking about the Amorites and that, and do you think that at some point in that any of the Israelites ever sat there and said, well, at least God dropped us off in Egypt for 400 years, as
Mm.
opposed to having to be maybe subservient to that people, like we might have been transformed to be like them, which, a little bit of a fast forward, there's going to be a couple of prophets that say that, Israel was worse than the Amorites in the middle of all this. So
Yeah.
it's maybe, even if they just take a step back and say, 400 years in Egypt, God had to get Egypt out of them. Well, maybe he needed to get them through that little stint so they could get to the next part of their story and get to the next part of their story, and so forth and so on. But God
Yeah.
has a plan through it all, and it might be dropping off people in Egypt. It might be waiting for really, wicked people to come back around. But
Mm-hmm.
in the middle of it, we need to sometimes sit back and say that, we like to focus on the wickedness that's happening in the world. Do we also need to sit back and say, God, thank you for the fact that you are allowing time and space for goodness to shine in that situation or your plan
Well,
to come through.
and all of that, right? Like, again, it just shows how good the Lord is and how perfect his plans for us are. And I know that that the Israelites suffered in Egypt. I know that the people of God went through hundreds of years. I mean, 400 years in Egypt.
Yeah.
That's crazy. At the time of this recording, the United States of America is barely half that old. So it'll be like a whole nother 200 years from now. Like, we just don't understand like the level of suffering that they went through. And it's easy for us to ask, God, why would you ever put us in a situation where we had to endure that? But God was doing something for both the Israelites and for the Amorites. And in both situations, his goodness was shining through. Now, I'm not trying to open up a conversation, especially when we got about less than 10 minutes left, about why bad things happen to good people. We could talk about that someday, but today's not going to be that day. But the essentials for this is that even when we think that God has abandoned us and the worst of the worst things are happening, God is still in control and God is still doing a good work according to his plan.
Amen. I think that's a good place to kind of stop and maybe have a little bit of reflection and sit there and say that, we should just be thankful that God has entered into this covenant with Abram. It's helped build on a story that's shaped all of our life because that ends up getting fulfilled through Jesus.
Yeah.
And we should just be thankful for the fact that we have a story that's been told between Genesis 15 and, the end of the Gospels that we get to kind of sit back and reflect. And it took a long time for that story to develop, but it's there for us for a reason. And we need to dig in on the word and try to partner with God in the middle of the story.
Yeah. That's so good. That's so good. Hey, Matt, thanks for all the comments. And Philip, thanks for the comments tonight and on Facebook. Man, we love it when you guys interact with us. Yeah, just keep it up. Anytime you see us on here, feel free to interact and ask as many questions because we are more than happy to pause and answer any questions that you might have.
Especially the tough ones for Jeremiah.
I don't know about that, but I can sure tell a story with it.
That's right.
That's good. Well, Nick, thanks again. We should be back next Wednesday. We're here Wednesday 9:00, and we'll keep this train rolling.
Sweet.
And if you
Thanks,
missed this
everybody.
live session, you can also always check us out on YouTube as well. We'll put the link in the descriptions.
Yeah. Sweet. Well, thanks for joining. You want to give us the sign off?
All right. It's a J23 Community Podcast. It's clarity for those who are curious or confused about all things Christian. I'm Jeremiah, along with Nick Hardcastle, and this was episode 20. God bless. Have a great day.